Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. First of all, if you are new here, thank you for watching. I post new book reviews almost every single day, so if you're looking for some reading inspiration to get through the summer or just like seeing book reviews on a wide variety of topics, then maybe think about sticking around. Now let's talk about today's book. Today we are going to be reviewing The Forever Witness: How DNA and Genealogy Solved a Cold Case Double Murder by Edward Humes. This is what the cover looks like. We have a road, some trees, and fog. It's about 350 pages long, and it is a nonfiction true crime book. So, a little bit of background on this book. I saw it on the shelf in the news section of my library, and I was drawn to it, even though I didn't expect to be drawn to it. So, what drew me to this book was the intersection of genealogy, DNA, and true crime. So I remember when the case broke where there was that killer down in California who had gone for years, I think he was active in the 70s, undetected. He had left his DNA behind, but we didn't have the technology at that time to trace DNA back to a person. And using these DNA and genealogy tools that have come forward in the last decade, they were able to track him down and arrest him and bring him to justice for the crimes, these horrible crimes that he committed in the 1970s. Over the last family holiday meaning like public holiday where I went to spend time with my extended family, I'm sure we all have been to one of those events, I wound up getting into a little bit of a discussion with my aunt about the role that DNA should play in solving true crime murders, for example, or particularly when people submit their DNA to things like 23andMe or like any of those other sites where you submit it and you find out that you're like, oh, I'm 30% Swedish or whatever. How that can be used by law enforcement to find killers, even though maybe you didn't know your DNA was going to be used in that way. So I got into a discussion with my aunt about this topic, and it is an interesting ethical question. So when I saw this book on the new shelf at my library, I was intrigued. Now, true crime in general is not my cup of tea. I am incredibly sensitive to violence, depictions of violence, recounts of violence, and I'm especially sensitive to true crime. I don't read a lot of things that are violent in nature in fiction, and well, I do think there's a place for true crime in nonfiction, and I don't care if someone else is less sensitive to violence and reading it as fiction is something they can tolerate. I don't have any problems with that. What you read as fiction is fine, and even nonfiction can have a true important role to play in society, reporting on how a case played out. Maybe writing a book brings accountability to the way that authorities mishandled a topic. Maybe writing a book on an unsolved case can generate tips or leads that maybe people didn't know they had information about that case and they were able to turn it in following a book. So I definitely don't think that true crime doesn't have a place, but I do find with true crime that sometimes it kind of leans too far. And when I say true crime, I mean all sorts of true crime, books, documentaries, podcasts. Sometimes it's done with good intentions to either tell a story, bring light to the victim and their family, talk about maybe how something was mishandled and try to bring some accountability into the process, or talk about a certain type of crime that is being overlooked statistically. But when it's done with the means to try to entertain and be something that like you're consuming for entertainment, and it's not fiction, it's true crime, it is someone whose family was actually irrevocably destroyed due to someone else's actions, I just feel like that starts to get a little iffy when you're treating that as some fun little thing you're gonna read. I do know there's like some natural curiosity about something. I feel like it's the same thing we experience when we're going past a car accident on the highway. You're horrified, but you also kind of want to look. But I feel like you do need to treat true crime with a little bit of sensitivity. So when I did check this book out of the library, I was hoping the focus of this book was going to be a lot more on the DNA and the ethics of using that to solve crimes, especially from people who didn't know their DNA data was going to be used like that, as opposed to sensationalizing the true crime aspect of the crime. Which I have to say, it's a true crime book. The violence is depicted, the violence is there, it is a tough read. But it's not, in my opinion, sensationalized. It's not done in a way to entertain you. The focus is kind of on the ethics of using this new DNA technology, discovery, technique to solve a crime and bring the person responsible or the person believed to be responsible to justice. And I think that focus is why this book despite me being very sensitive to it and having to put it down multiple times to just take a break and step away, I think ultimately this falls more in the category of the kind of true crime that I feel like is appropriate to write about, where you're just talking about a situation, discussing the ethics of a new sort of technology, and done in a respectful way. So I do want to put that out there because I do have some qualms with some of the stuff that's true crime out there, and it's not usually a genre I read, so I do want to explain why I'm picking a book from that genre to read. So The Forever Witness, as I've already mentioned, this is about using DNA to solve a case. So kind of a breakdown of this book. This book follows the case of, I think her name is pronounced Tanya. It's spelled like Tanya, but I think they said it's pronounced Tanya. Tanya Van Cuylenborg and her boyfriend Jay Cook. They were like 18 and 20. They were very young kids who lived in Canada, and they were going down to Seattle. I believe they lived in Vancouver, so right across the border to Seattle to do a little bit of business for Jay Cook's father, I believe it was. And they basically didn't show up at home on their appointed time. These are people who were expected, they were the kind of people who would check in with their family, so it was very unusual, and unfortunately both individuals were found to be killed in a pretty graphic way, and there was basically no witnesses. No one really had any idea the motive behind this, and it was a cold case for many, many years. The book is set out, so first we have an overview of the crime, the situation, everything leading up to the crime, what people knew happened, and then the discovery of their bodies. Then we have the investigation as it stood back in the 1980s, where it went, leads, people that were tracked down, people that were eliminated, things that happened after the crime. Then we have a section where we talk about this DNA, when DNA came onto the scene. So we talk about Edward Humes talks about this time that happened probably within the last couple decades, where people became more and more open to doing the DNA testing, and the tools were there to do it. So people were doing those things that we've all seen, 23andMe, where you take a swab of your mouth sample and you send it in, and they come back and say that you're 30% European or whatever, and 20% from Asia or 20% from Korea. Like they tell you basically where in the world you are from, with some degrees of accuracy and inaccuracy. They can't really tell everything perfectly, but they can kind of give you a general sense of where in the world you are from. Also combined with this DNA, you can kind of use the DNA and the person who submitted the DNA to build a family tree and tell how people are related. For those of you interested, you can just put in like 23andMe testing disaster online, and you can find all sorts of posts on websites like Reddit detailing how people found out that their dad's not their dad, or their brother isn't their real brother, they were adopted. So this opens up a door to a lot of stuff that was previously thought to be private and now is no longer private. And that kind of is the crux of the situation. Things that were thought to be private might no longer be private, or things that you thought would never come to light might be coming to light now, which might be a little awkward or weird if maybe as a parent you didn't want one of your kids to know that they were actually fathered by someone else. I mean, you can discuss maybe you deserve to have that brought to light, maybe you didn't, depending on the circumstances. The ethics of that is really the question, and that's not something that I feel like I'm gonna answer. I have my opinions, but I'm not gonna really put out where my opinions fall. But I think that's the important question that's being explored here. What happens when someone who thought they were gonna get away with a crime, who left DNA behind, but DNA wasn't really usable at that time, thought they were gonna get away with it, has some distant relative submit a DNA sample, and using that DNA sample, a genetic genealogist is able to build out a family tree, find a likely suspect, and turn that suspect name over to law enforcement. The genetic genealogy section focuses on a woman named CeCe Moore, who is really a key figure in this field, who's done a lot of work and was able to crack a lot of cold cases on that. So there's a section following the crime and the investigation that just talks about this field and some of the ethical questions and concerns. This is the part that I found most interesting. Once we move past the horrific crime, the details of the crime, and we got more into the ethics section, that's the part that I was most interested in. For example, what expectation to a right of privacy does a person have? The author makes a very interesting point. People use these to, for example, find their biological families if they have been adopted out, and that was more or less seen as a good thing, but maybe the biological family wanted privacy. Maybe the biological family doesn't want to be contacted or tracked down. And does a criminal have a right to privacy if, for example, they killed 2 young Canadian teenagers and young adults on an international trip across the border? I would say that that person doesn't have a right to privacy. They deserve to be caught. But where does that ethical line fall? Maybe someone who submits their DNA to 23andMe didn't know that law enforcement was going to be looking at their profile. Of course, there's a lot of ethical questions. Like I said, I think everyone's opinion is going to be different. I feel like there's a lot of stuff to unpack, and I personally wish the ethics and questions section, which just falls 3/4 of the way through this book, was longer. I feel like Edward Hume kind of just touched on the major topics, touched on the major questions, did some like pros and cons in each category, but I really feel like he could have added 100 pages to that section, and that would be really what I'm looking for. Maybe in picking up this book, I really wanted a book more on the ethics of using DNA testing to find criminals from the past and less on the actual crime itself. And this is, at the end of the day, a true crime book, so maybe I shouldn't have expected that going in. So after the part about the genetic genealogy, they talk about how that was applied to the case of Tanya and Jay Cook, and how the person who was matched to the DNA was brought to trial, and how this evidence was presented in court, and how it brought about a conviction. So that's kind of the narrative flow of this story. Now, as a critique, I've already kind of critiqued the part that I really wanted more ethics. I don't really want to critique this too hard. I feel weird talking about or reviewing true crime books, because how can you review a family's personal experience with such a horrific crime? That was really a 4-star true crime. Like, no, someone's family was personally affected. I feel like I don't really have it's not my place to talk about that side, but I can talk about some things that maybe I wish the author had done or structured differently in the book. So that's really what I'm trying to focus on in this review. First of all, like I already said, I wish that focus on the ethical concerns and questions about using DNA testing was explored a little bit further, a little bit deeper. I think that would have been a lot more interesting, and I feel like there was a lot more that could have been put there, but it was maybe cut down in favor of the true crime section. Maybe I wanted a book that was less tied to one specific case, but more tied to the ethics of using DNA testing against these large databases to solve crimes in general. So maybe it was like an expectation thing. I find that a lot of the times when you read a book, the expectations you have going into the book really color the way you see the book. But I also think there was one section that kind of broke the flow. Overall, this is a very well put together book. I feel like it flows very naturally. But there was one section that I feel like just didn't fit where I thought it would. Shortly after, I believe it was shortly after the bodies were found and the investigation was ongoing on the crime that was committed, the author takes a break and steps away to talk about a woman who was homeless, living in her car, pregnant with, I believe, her 3rd kid, who decides after giving birth to her kid in the car that she's living in like a parking garage, that she can't take care of this kid, and she decides to take the kid and leave it behind a grocery store next to a dumpster, so it's going to be found. And eventually the kid is found, the kid is taken into custody sounds like is being arrested. It was like 24 hours old. It gets brought into care and it winds up being adopted out. And eventually, using DNA genealogy, they're able to that baby was able to reconnect to the biological family when they were much older, to see where they came from and learn about their origins. This was put in my opinion, in kind of a weird spot. It kind of interrupted the flow we were going for in like the historical section, the true crime section, the part where you're talking about the investigation. We kind of derailed to talk about this baby that was born. I think maybe the author put it there because the time this baby was born, this baby who would really be one of the first people, if I remember correctly, to be like reconnected with their family in this way, because they were born very close to the time when these 2 individuals died. So like maybe that was the connection they were trying to make, but I just feel like that was one thing that broke up the narrative flow a little bit. So yeah, that was just another critique. I feel like that could have been moved to a little section to keep the flow going, and I feel like the ethics section could have been expanded. But overall, I think this was a very well done book. Even though the ethics section was smaller than I wanted, I feel like it felt well balanced. The author kind of weighed many of the different sides. I don't think they addressed all the sides or all the issues. Again, this felt more like a true crime book than like an ethical questions book. So I think they could have added more there, but overall it was well balanced. It took up a decent chunk of the book. I feel like things flowed smoothly. I feel like the violence wasn't glorified or made to be entertaining in any sort of way, but it was really supposed to be reflective of the horrible crime that was committed. And I feel like there's plenty of information provided without, again, being overly graphic or unnecessary. But overall, I think it was a well done book. I think if you're interested in these ethical sort of questions, you're interested in seeing where the future is going, if you're interested in learning about how this kind of technology came to be, then this might be a very interesting or good book for you. If you like true crime, this might be a good book for you, especially if you're trying to avoid the true crime books that over sensationalize or treat it like some sort of fun, cute activity to read about. This might be a good one. I feel like it treats the subject matter with an appropriate amount of seriousness. So overall, I think this is a well done book. And despite me being very sensitive to it, I'm probably not going to pick up a true crime book anytime soon because, again, I am just incredibly sensitive to violence and crime and stuff like that. I think it was well done, and I'm really glad that I read it. If you have any other books similar to this that you would like to recommend, I would love to hear it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.